The crack of a gunshot shattered the peaceful Saturday morning like a hammer through glass. Claire dropped to one knee instinctively, her hand flashing to her hip where her service weapon usually rested during missions. But today, visiting her parents in a quiet suburban neighborhood, she was unarmed, dressed down in jeans and a faded FBI Academy hoodie. I yanked the front door open so hard it slammed into the wall behind me and sprinted onto the porch, heart hammering in my chest. Across the lawn, I saw her, my daughter, standing calm as stone, with a barrel of a pistol pointed right at her chest by a man whose face was as red as a fire hydrant. It took a second to register what was happening. Our HOA's so-called security officer, Doug, a guy whose only real battlefield experience was probably arguing over coupons at Costco, had pulled a gun on my daughter. And he had no idea she was an FBI tactical commander who could dismantle him in about 3 moves without even messing up her hair. That morning had started like a postcard. The sun was bright, the lawns were freshly mowed, and the smell of someone grilling bacon wafted through the air. Claire had arrived with her usual smile, handing me a bag of donuts she picked up on the way. We had laughed, catching up on life after her last assignment, and she parked her Jeep halfway over what I vaguely remembered was a visitor parking only section. The lines had faded long ago, barely visible even if you squinted, and nobody cared. Nobody except Doug, apparently. I heard the commotion before I saw it, Doug's high-pitched barking, the squeal of tires as he raced his battered HOA golf cart across the street like he was chasing a bank robber. Claire hadn't even had a chance to grab her coffee before Doug screeched to a halt and came at her, waving a clipboard like it was a weapon, then escalating faster than anyone could believe. "You can't park here!" Doug shrieked, spittle flying from his lips as he puffed up his chest. Claire, calm as ever, leaned casually against the side of her Jeep, arms crossed. She asked for clarification. Where exactly did it say visitors couldn't park? Doug fumbled with his clipboard, muttering about unwritten community guidelines, then demanded identification. Claire, having seen this game play out in far more dangerous places, simply smiled and declined. That refusal seemed to flip a switch in Doug. His face went from pink to crimson, his hands shook, and then, in the most idiotic move of his life, he drew the gun holstered on his belt. Now, standing there on the porch, I froze for a half-second. 1,000 thoughts collided in my brain. Should I run over? Should I shout? Should I call 911? Claire, seeing my movement, gave the tiniest shake of her head. Stay back. She had it under control. Doug, meanwhile, was screaming about citizens' arrests and suspicious persons, and defending the HOA's integrity, sounding less like a security official and more like a kid playing sheriff in the backyard. A crowd started gathering, neighbors peeking from behind bushes and fences, phones raised, recording. Some of them even laughed, thinking it was some kind of HOA skit. It wasn't until Doug racked the slide on his gun, whether he intended to fire or was just trying to look tough, that the mood shifted instantly from ridiculous to terrifying. Claire didn't flinch. If anything, her stance got even more relaxed, like she was negotiating with an angry chihuahua. She spoke slowly, evenly, with the kind of voice that made men 3 times Doug's size rethink their choices. She asked Doug if he really wanted to escalate this situation. Doug, completely drunk on his tiny scrap of authority, only screamed louder, demanding she get on the ground and surrender. Claire's eyes flicked once toward the growing crowd, calculating. Then she reached slowly into her pocket, and I saw Doug's finger twitch nervously on the trigger. It felt like time froze. Every muscle in my body screamed to tackle him, to protect her, but I knew Claire. She wasn't just a field agent. She was a tactical commander. She had trained teams to handle hostage crises, bomb threats, active shooters. Doug was a mosquito to her, an inconvenience to be swatted at precisely the right moment. From her pocket, she pulled out a slim black wallet. Doug barked something unintelligible, probably trying to claim it was a weapon. Claire flicked the wallet open with 2 fingers and held it up for everyone to see. The gold badge inside gleamed in the sunlight, and even from across the lawn, the words were unmistakable: Federal Bureau of Investigation. The air sucked out of the cul-de-sac. Silence fell so heavily you could hear a neighbor drop their phone onto the concrete. Doug's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on land. Claire's voice, calm and cold, slid through the stunned air. She informed him that he had just committed aggravated assault on a federal officer. She told him, gently but firmly, that he was now under investigation for brandishing a firearm illegally, impersonating an officer, and unlawful detainment. She asked him if he had anything to say for himself before she called for backup. Doug's gun hand sagged. His eyes darted around wildly, looking for some support from the crowd, but the neighbors who had once cheered his security efforts were now filming with wide-eyed horror. Doug stammered something about being authorized by the HOA, protecting community standards, citizen rights. Claire just tilted her head slightly, like she was watching a particularly sad episode of a courtroom drama. With the flick of a hidden mic clipped inside her hoodie, Claire tapped into her comm line and said the words that would change everything. "Dispatch, this is Agent Claire Matthews, badge 87392. I have an armed individual threatening a federal officer. Immediate backup requested, location transmitting now." Doug's knees literally buckled. His gun clattered to the ground, and he dropped to his knees, hands raised high, blubbering about how he didn't know, how he didn't mean to, how it was all a mistake. Sirens roared in the distance, growing louder by the second. I finally stepped off the porch, walking toward Claire as she stood above Doug, watching him with the detached patience of someone waiting for a mosquito to stop buzzing so she could finish her coffee. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The look in Claire's eyes said it all. Doug thought he could control the situation with a gun and a title he made up. What he didn't know was that he had just picked a fight with one of the deadliest women on the East Coast, and she hadn't even needed to lay a hand on him. Claire stood over Doug like a statue, her badge still shining under the morning sun. Doug was trying to figure out if he could somehow explain this disaster away, but every breath he took just made things worse. He opened his mouth again, maybe to beg, maybe to lie, but Claire's voice cut through the heavy air before he could form a single word. She asked him one simple question in a tone so flat and cold it would have frozen lava. Was he even licensed to carry that firearm? Doug's eyes went wild. He stammered about community protection and Second Amendment rights, but never answered the actual question. Claire didn't blink. She watched him with the patience of someone who had seen hardened criminals crack under questioning, knowing that if you let someone dig long enough, they would bury themselves without any help. Neighbors clustered around the scene now, all recording, whispering, sharing looks. It wasn't every day you saw a wannabe security officer get pantsed metaphorically in front of the whole neighborhood. Doug, sensing he was losing control, tried to bark orders at the growing crowd, telling them to disperse, calling it a private matter. Claire simply held up her badge again, this time turning to the nearest cluster of gawkers and calmly stating that anyone tampering with evidence or interfering with an ongoing federal investigation would be charged appropriately. That cleared a good 5 feet of breathing room immediately. Phones stayed up, but people stopped shouting suggestions or narrating for their TikTok. Claire's control over the situation was absolute, and Doug knew it. He looked like he was about to either faint or throw up, maybe both. Doug's hand twitched toward his belt, maybe reaching for some kind of fake badge or made-up ID, but Claire's eyes sharpened. She warned him without raising her voice that any further movement could be interpreted as a threat. That was enough to freeze Doug mid-reach, his fingers twitching helplessly in the air. Claire took a slow step forward, lowering her voice into something you usually heard in interrogation rooms right before someone confessed to 3 felonies and a parking ticket. She asked him again, did he have any legal right to be carrying that weapon, issuing demands, or threatening citizens on public or private property? Doug's lip quivered. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Claire gave a little nod, almost like she was pleased by the silence. She turned slightly and, with the ease of years of experience, reached for her radio again. With crisp efficiency, she updated dispatch on the situation, noting the armed suspect was subdued, compliant, and under watch pending the arrival of local law enforcement. Doug started babbling again about how he was just following HOA protocol, authorized neighborhood watch, and acting in defense of the rules, but nobody was listening anymore. The crowd had shifted. Where there was once curiosity and gossip, now there was a heavy, disapproving silence. Parents pulled their kids behind them. Retirees shook their heads. Even the neighborhood busybody, Mrs. Hargrove, who loved nothing more than tattling on minor infractions, looked ready to bury Doug in the nearest flower bed. The distant sirens grew louder, closer, shrieking through the otherwise idyllic streets. Doug's head whipped around like a trapped animal. Claire didn't move. She just stood there, hands loose at her sides, a quiet force of nature, while Doug fidgeted and squirmed. It wasn't just that he knew he was going to be arrested. It was that he knew, in every cell of his body, that he had completely humiliated himself in front of the very people whose approval he had been desperate to win. His dream of being the town's hero, the righteous defender of the HOA code, was collapsing in front of his eyes. At that moment, as if fate itself decided to twist the knife, Karen stormed onto the scene. Karen, the HOA president, marched in like a discount dictator, armed with a clipboard thicker than a phone book and a scowl that could curdle milk. She pointed a trembling finger at Claire and demanded to know what was going on. She shouted that this was private HOA jurisdiction, and non-residents had no right to be here. Claire didn't even dignify it with a full look. She just turned her head slightly, raised her badge higher, and stated flatly that she was a federal agent operating under legal authority due to a felony assault committed by an armed civilian. Karen didn't miss a beat. She shifted gears immediately, insisting Claire was impersonating law enforcement, that she had no real jurisdiction, and that the HOA had every right to detain and fine anyone they deemed a threat. It was like watching a chicken argue with a freight train. Claire let her rant for precisely 30 seconds before speaking again. In one chilling sentence, she informed Karen that interfering with a federal investigation was obstruction of justice, a felony punishable by prison time and heavy fines. Karen faltered but tried to regain her footing, blustering about lawsuits and rights and constitutional amendments that had nothing to do with anything. Doug, seeing his supposed ally unravel, started crawling metaphorically toward whatever scraps of defense he could find. That's when the squad cars arrived. 3 black and white cruisers skidded into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing, doors flinging open as officers poured out. They took one look at the scene, the tense crowd, the federal badge, the trembling, armed HOA officer, and moved fast. Claire didn't even have to raise her voice. She gave a short, professional briefing to the officers, laying out the facts calmly, while Doug stood there visibly sweating through his uniform shirt. One officer carefully secured Doug's firearm while another cuffed him, reading him his rights. Doug whimpered something about how he didn't know she was FBI, how he thought he was doing his duty. Nobody cared. It didn't matter what he thought. It mattered what he did. Brandishing a firearm without cause. Threatening a federal agent. Impersonating authority. He was cooked before he even got into the back seat of the cruiser. Karen, somehow thinking she could salvage the situation, tried again to argue. She shoved her clipboard under a sergeant's nose, ranting about bylaws and community standards. The sergeant, a woman with the face of someone who had zero patience for suburban drama, looked at her like she was speaking ancient Greek. Karen demanded Claire be arrested too, claiming the whole thing was entrapment. Claire didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The sergeant just shook her head slowly and warned Karen that if she continued interfering, she would be charged right alongside Doug. Karen finally shut her mouth but burned a hole into the pavement with the force of her glare. The crowd was buzzing now, their phones capturing every second. This wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. It was a full-on viral moment in the making. As Doug was bundled into a cruiser and driven away, Claire finally allowed herself the tiniest, most imperceptible smile. Not a smile of victory. A smile of quiet satisfaction that a bully with a badge had been stopped before someone really got hurt. She turned to me, voice light, and asked if there was any coffee left. I nodded dumbly and led her back into the house, both of us leaving behind the stunned silence of a neighborhood that had just witnessed the very definition of poetic justice. The street stayed oddly silent even after the squad cars pulled away, as if the entire neighborhood had been dunked into cold water and was still trying to figure out what had just happened. Claire moved like nothing unusual had occurred, strolling back to the house with the same casual energy she would have used if she had just finished a light jog instead of neutralizing an armed idiot in broad daylight. I handed her a fresh cup of coffee as we stepped inside, still half in shock, still trying to process the last hour. She smiled and thanked me, sitting down at the kitchen table like she was just catching up after a long day at work. I sat across from her, the words bouncing around in my mouth, but it was Claire who broke the silence first, asking me if the neighborhood had always been that dramatic. I laughed, short and sharp, the absurdity of the morning finally catching up to me. Meanwhile, outside, the real show was just beginning. Claire had triggered an avalanche without even trying. Word traveled faster than wildfire around here, and within the hour, people who had missed the live performance were showing up on foot and by golf cart, pestering anyone who had seen what happened. Smartphones flashed like paparazzi cameras. Neighbors huddled in tight circles whispering, replaying the events with growing exaggeration. Some insisted Doug had pulled an automatic weapon. Others swore Claire had flipped him over her shoulder like a martial artist before the police arrived. In the midst of this gossip storm, Karen was nowhere to be seen, which told me she was either plotting or panicking, both of which were dangerous in her case. Claire, sipping her coffee, mentioned that it was probably a good idea to check if Doug was acting alone or if other members of the so-called HOA security squad were also armed. I blinked. I hadn't even thought about that. If Doug had gotten himself a weapon and fake authority, who was to say others hadn't done the same? Claire pulled out her phone, tapping out a few quick messages. Within minutes, she had looped in a few colleagues who specialized in rapid information gathering. Nothing formal yet, just a quick sweep. Claire was a professional, but she also knew how to lay low until the right moment. Not long after, the first domino fell. One of the officers who had responded earlier called Claire directly, letting her know they had found another security member wandering around with an illegally modified baton and a taser disguised as a flashlight. No permits, no certifications, just blind entitlement and bad judgment. The officer casually mentioned that the HOA security team might be operating without any real authority, which was, at minimum, a civil violation and, depending on the circumstances, could balloon into criminal charges. Claire thanked him, hung up, and smiled over her coffee like she had just been given a particularly satisfying puzzle to solve. Outside, the neighbors were growing bolder. They were approaching our driveway now, forming little clusters of murmuring people, casting glances at the house as if hoping Claire would emerge and give an encore performance. Some just wanted to thank her. Others wanted details. Most were still trying to figure out how the power structure of their little suburban kingdom had shifted so dramatically in less than an hour. Karen, finally making her reappearance, strode down the street with a few loyalists behind her, looking like a queen whose castle was under siege. She ignored everyone who tried to stop her, brushing aside questions and ignoring the disapproving looks now aimed squarely at her. Claire, seeing Karen marching toward the house, set her coffee down with a sigh and stood up. I could see it in her posture. She wasn't angry. She was calculating. She opened the front door before Karen could knock, standing there with the casual authority of someone who had walked into far worse situations. Karen launched into a tirade immediately, accusing Claire of harassment, threatening to file a lawsuit against her personally and against the entire federal agency she represented. She demanded Claire release Doug immediately and drop all charges, as if she had the power to rewrite reality by simply insisting hard enough. Claire listened politely for exactly 45 seconds, then cut her off with a single question. Was Karen aware that Doug had pulled a loaded firearm on a federal agent and that brandishing a weapon during a supposed citizens' interaction was not only illegal but would lead to federal charges? Karen blinked, thrown off by the cold precision of Claire's words. Claire continued, informing her that if she had any knowledge of Doug's activities, or if she had approved the HOA security operations without proper licenses or oversight, she could be facing serious legal exposure herself. Karen's mouth flapped open, but no sound came out for a good 10 seconds. Then came the panic. Karen shifted tactics immediately, insisting she had no idea Doug was armed, that she had never authorized any use of weapons, that the security team was supposed to be a visual deterrent only. She practically fell over herself trying to distance herself from Doug. Claire, listening with the same impassive calm, asked if Karen would be willing to provide the HOA's financial records to show whether any funds had been used to purchase weapons, uniforms, or unauthorized security gear. Karen paled. She mumbled something about needing to check with the board and consult HOA legal counsel, and then fled the porch with surprising speed for someone who usually moved like molasses. As Karen retreated, Claire stepped back inside, closing the door with a quiet finality. She turned to me, grinning, and said it was about to get really interesting. She explained that whenever people in small groups taste power, they get sloppy. They cut corners. They stop worrying about little things like accountability or transparency. And when they get caught, they panic, and in their panic, they usually reveal far more than they intend. She bet that somewhere in the HOA's records was a paper trail leading straight to Karen's front door. By mid-afternoon, police had canvassed the area and found even more HOA security members carrying everything from pepper spray to illegal stun guns. One even had a pair of brass knuckles proudly displayed on his belt like it was part of a legitimate uniform. The officers collected the illegal items, took statements from more than a dozen witnesses, and made it clear that the investigation was only just beginning. Claire, watching from the window with her second cup of coffee, looked entirely unbothered, like she was watching a very predictable, very slow car crash. The real tipping point came when local news caught wind of the story. A helicopter buzzed overhead around sunset, cameras zooming in on the now infamous cul-de-sac where HOA law enforcement had been exposed as a farce. Reporters interviewed neighbors, capturing juicy soundbites about the absurdity of the situation. The HOA board went into full defensive mode, issuing a vague statement about reviewing internal policies and reaffirming commitment to community safety. Nobody believed them. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. It was as if an invisible storm had rolled through and stripped away the pretty masks everyone had been wearing for years. Gone was the cozy illusion of HOA harmony, replaced by whispered conversations at driveways, awkward glances at the park, and an undeniable tension in the air. Claire sat outside with her coffee again, sunglasses on, casually scrolling through her phone as if nothing at all was happening. But we both knew the volcano was rumbling just beneath the surface. The HOA Emergency Meeting had been announced for noon at the community center, and although they called it a friendly open forum, everyone knew it was going to be a battlefield. By the time Claire and I walked toward the building, the parking lot was overflowing. Cars were lined up along curbs, across lawns, and even squeezed half illegally into side alleys. The entire neighborhood had shown up, some out of outrage, some out of fear, and many just for the drama. Inside, the tension was thick enough to taste. Karen stood at the front, flanked by two board members who looked like they regretted every life choice that had led them there. She tapped the microphone like a nervous substitute teacher, her smile stretched tight across her face. Claire and I found seats near the back, which gave Claire a full view of every person in the room. She leaned over and whispered that it was always better to sit in the back at events like this. Less chance of getting boxed in if things turned chaotic. I nodded, trying not to laugh because the advice sounded like it belonged more in a war zone than a suburban clubhouse. Karen launched into her speech, full of empty platitudes about understanding the community's concerns and taking steps to improve safety procedures. Her words bounced off the walls, hollow and meaningless. She refused to mention Doug by name, only referring to the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding involving a volunteer. Claire raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She was playing the long game, waiting. Karen babbled on about forming a new oversight committee and conducting internal reviews and other bureaucratic nonsense designed to make it seem like she was fixing things without actually admitting guilt. For a few minutes, it almost looked like the crowd might let her slide by with her dignity intact. Then the questions started. First came a simple one from an elderly man asking why the security team had firearms in the first place. Karen dodged it, claiming they were never authorized to carry weapons. Claire gave a barely visible smile, sensing the cracks. Another neighbor, a woman who rarely spoke at meetings, stood up and asked if HOA funds had been used to buy any of the equipment confiscated yesterday. Karen blanched but stuck to her script, promising full transparency after the internal review. The room murmured, restless, the crowd leaning forward like sharks circling a bleeding seal. Then Claire stood up. She introduced herself calmly as an FBI tactical commander and said that she had been involved personally in the investigation now underway. You could feel the air being sucked out of the room. Heads whipped around. Phones lifted. The board members flinched. Karen looked like she had swallowed a wasp. Claire didn't accuse, didn't rant. She simply laid out a series of facts in a tone so calm and professional it made Karen's bluster look even more childish. She confirmed that several weapons had been confiscated, that some HOA funds had indeed been used to purchase security equipment without proper disclosure to the community, and that a formal federal inquiry into misuse of funds and illegal security operations was already underway. The room exploded. People shouted questions, accusations, demands. Claire stayed cool, letting the chaos roll around her while Karen tried desperately to regain control. A few neighbors demanded Karen resign immediately. Others shouted about lawsuit. Someone near the front demanded to see the HOA's financials right then and there. Karen, face blotchy with rage, screamed that Claire was lying, that she had no jurisdiction, that it was all a political attack. Claire didn't even bother responding. She just pulled a folded sheet of paper from her pocket and handed it to the nearest officer in the room, a formal notice of federal investigation, signed and sealed. The officer read it aloud, and that was the final blow. Karen's few remaining supporters melted away like snow in the sun. The board members quietly edged away from her, one even stepping down mid-meeting and announcing he had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. Within 10 minutes, Karen was standing alone at the front of the room, facing a crowd that wanted blood. Her voice broke as she tried to salvage what little dignity she had left, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted entirely. Claire sat down again, sipping her coffee, watching as Karen stumbled through a tearful speech about how she had only ever wanted to protect the neighborhood. The community voted that afternoon to suspend Karen and most of the current board members pending a full audit. An emergency interim committee was formed, made up of volunteers who had been the quiet, sensible ones all along, the ones who hadn't played power games or held grudges over hedge height violations. Claire was asked to advise the new board, but she politely declined, saying her work was done here. She had no interest in running a suburban drama club. She had just wanted to ensure the people who thought they were above the law learned otherwise. Outside, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, neighbors came up to thank her, to shake her hand, to offer home-baked pies and heartfelt apologies for how everything had spiraled. Claire accepted it all with humility, never once acting like a hero, even though she was the only reason the entire neighborhood hadn't turned into a headline for all the wrong reasons. I watched her with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. My daughter had faced down a gun, a corrupt HOA, and an entire system built on arrogance, and she had done it without firing a single shot or raising her voice once. As we walked home, Claire mentioned that she'd be heading back to her base in a few days. She had other missions, bigger threats to face, real bad guys to catch. But she also said something that stuck with me. Sometimes, she said, the small battles mattered just as much as the big ones. Because every time you stopped a bully from thinking they were untouchable, you reminded everyone else that justice wasn't just for the headlines. It was for the everyday places too, for the cul-de-sacs and coffee shops and ordinary streets where real people lived. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. We reached the house, the warm lights spilling onto the lawn, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt safe again. Not because of gates or fake cops or silly rules, but because someone had stood up and said enough. Someone who knew that real authority wasn't about shouting the loudest or carrying the biggest stick. It was about protecting the people who couldn't always protect themselves. And that someone, I realized with a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude, was my daughter. The days that followed felt like a slow but satisfying unwinding of an old, tangled rope. News of the HOA disaster spread far beyond our little neighborhood, trickling through social media feeds, picked up by local reporters, and even sparking a short segment on a national morning show under the headline, "When HOA Authority Goes Wrong." Claire, thankfully, was never mentioned by name in the media coverage, but around here, everyone knew. They didn't just know, they remembered. Every morning when Claire stepped outside for her coffee, someone new would wave a little too eagerly, or a neighbor would nervously offer a plate of cookies as a thank you. It was a strange, quiet kind of fame, the kind you earned not by shouting or demanding attention but by standing unshakable when everyone else lost their heads. Karen, on the other hand, couldn't walk 10 feet without feeling the weight of the community's eyes on her. Her world had collapsed, and it showed. Within a week of the meeting, she resigned officially, though she called it a leave of absence in her frantic Facebook post, trying to save face. No one bought it. Anonymous tipsters sent recordings of the HOA meetings to higher authorities. Several audits were launched into the HOA's financial practices, and soon enough, the IRS got involved. We heard from a neighbor who worked at the courthouse that Karen had been served official notices about pending investigations into mismanagement of community funds, tax irregularities, and unauthorized security operations. Doug, meanwhile, was still sitting in a cell somewhere, waiting for his court date. Rumor had it that his lawyer tried to spin the story that Doug had been traumatized by imagined threats to the neighborhood and had acted out of fear. But nobody was buying that either. Claire laughed when she heard, not out of cruelty but because it was always the same story. People who abused power always painted themselves as victims once the consequences arrived at their doorstep. Despite the mess, something beautiful started happening. For the first time in years, the neighbors actually talked to each other without suspicion or fear of being tattled on. Kids played freely in the parks again without some self-appointed officer patrolling like a prison warden. Lawn disputes, parking complaints, and minor grievances seemed to lose their edge. It was like everyone collectively realized that maybe, just maybe, being neighborly was more important than being right. The heavy weight of rules, fines, and threats lifted, and laughter started to replace the tension that had gripped the community for so long. Claire didn't stick around to enjoy the fruits of her work for too long. She had missions to return to, and before we knew it, her departure day arrived. The neighborhood organized an impromptu send-off, casual and informal. There were lawn chairs lined up in the cul-de-sac, folding tables covered in homemade snacks, and a giant poster board that simply said "Thank you" with dozens of signatures scribbled across it. Claire accepted the thanks with her usual modesty, reminding people that she had only done what anyone should do when faced with injustice. She even cracked a few jokes about starting a private consulting firm called HOA SWAT Team Services, which sent everyone into fits of laughter. Before she left, she pulled me aside for a quiet moment. She said that she wasn't worried about the neighborhood anymore. The people here had been scared into silence for so long they had forgotten they had power too, real power. The kind that didn't come from fake security titles or bogus fines but from standing together. She hoped they would remember it long after she was gone. I promised her they would. Watching her drive away down the newly peaceful street, I knew it wasn't just hope. It was certainty. Meanwhile, karma continued doing its job. Karen's house went up for sale faster than anyone expected, listed quietly through an agency no one around here used. People whispered about frozen accounts and pending lawsuit. The once feared queen of the HOA was now just another angry neighbor nobody missed. On the day the moving trucks pulled into her driveway, a small group of teenagers staged a farewell parade with handmade signs reading, "By Karen," and "Good luck finding a new kingdom." Karen scowled at them, tried to call the police, and ended up retreating inside her nearly empty house. No one came to her defense. No one shed a tear when she drove away. Doug's story wasn't much better. Word traveled that his trial was scheduled for the following month, and that the charges against him were serious enough that he might be facing actual jail time. Somewhere deep down, I wondered if he regretted any of it. Regretted pointing a gun at an innocent woman, regretted letting his tiny taste of power mutate into something dangerous. But then again, people like Doug rarely learned. They just stewed in their bitterness, blaming everyone else for their own downfall. Life moved on, and the new HOA leadership made sure it moved on in the right direction. Rules were rewritten with transparency in mind. Financial disclosures were posted publicly every month. The so-called security team was permanently disbanded, replaced by a simple, rotating volunteer watch that mostly helped organize block parties and community cleanup. The heavy, toxic atmosphere that had hung over the neighborhood evaporated, replaced by something lighter, freer. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every so often, someone would bring up Claire's name at a meeting or a barbecue. They would talk about that day when everything changed. Not as gossip anymore, but with a kind of grateful awe. She had done what no one else had dared to do. She had stood between the community and the storm and refused to back down. And in doing so, she had given everyone else the courage to do the same. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the streets in gold, I sat on the porch sipping coffee, just like Claire used to. I thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the chaos, the justice, the healing. It wasn't the kind of story you heard often. It wasn't big, flashy news. But it mattered. It mattered to every kid riding their bike without fear, every parent chatting with a neighbor without worrying about being reported, every elderly couple walking hand in hand down the sidewalk without being harassed. Justice hadn't come with sirens blazing or dramatic showdowns. It had come with calm, quiet strength. It had come from someone who knew that real power wasn't about intimidation or control. It was about protecting the people who needed it most, even if they didn't know how much they needed it yet. And somewhere out there, I knew Claire was doing it all over again. Different town, different faces, same mission. She wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't chasing medals. She was chasing something far more important. She was making sure that wherever she went, the bullies, the petty tyrants, and the fake kings with their fake crowns would always have to answer to someone who stood for something real. Someone who didn't just talk about justice but lived it every single day. Someone who, no matter what, would never back down.